This week in media, New York Times editorial content is coming to Amazon products. Business Insider's employee union rails against corporate greed amidst layoffs, while YouTube continues to stranglehold TV. But what's it all mean? We've got AdWeek Media Reporter Mark Stenberg in the house to break it down. Hey Mark, welcome to Make That Make Sense.
Hey Eric, thanks for having me.
Should we get to our headline?
Yeah, let's do it.
So this comes out of a great piece from Lucas Shaw at Bloomberg talking about the rise of YouTube to not just being this creator platform, but basically being the center of entertainment. And one of the stats they threw out in the article was that more people now view YouTube on TV than on their phones and computers, which is like eye-opening from what it was just a couple of years ago. So do you see this as a huge platform shift from people are getting their television from streaming services just to YouTube? Or is this kind of just a moment in time and it's going to come back around?
Yeah, great question. I think probably something in the middle, right? Like YouTube definitely has done an amazing job of really capitalizing, I think, on its ubiquity. YouTube as a brand has been unchanged and persistent for a decade plus, almost 2 decades, I think. It's free. I think that's a massively understated element of its appeal. Everyone can watch it. You don't need a subscription. That certainly helps it reach sort of the large base that it does. I think, though, in that piece, Lucas really lays out some of the inherent constraints that would prevent YouTube from usurping some of the legacy media titles that sort of are in the pole position at the moment. And to me, that comes down to really the economic model, which is to say he profiles this, up and coming sitcom creator who himself kind of bemoans the fact that like ultimately you have to self-fund these things. You only get 55% of the ad revenue that you take in. And unless you have some sort of reader revenue or viewer revenue program on top, you're just not going to be able to take in as much money, and you're going to have to really be responsible for that capital outlay at the beginning. So I think what you see a lot of, and again, this is exhibited in the piece, is creators looking at YouTube as a way to get recognized. And then you have success on YouTube, and then where do you go? You graduate to one of the streaming services. They talked about this with all the children's content as well. I think if YouTube really wanted to flip a switch and start charging Netflix type subscription prices, which is not insane. I know they have some subscription products at the moment, then maybe that changes. But I think at the moment, you kind of have to follow the talent. And I think if the talent doesn't have a way to make kind of prestige level programming without having to self-fund it, then inevitably it's going to be treated as like a training ground from which you graduate. So I think it serves a very valuable role. And I have maybe other thoughts on this, but I think the statistics are undeniable. And I think that Lucas and Julia and all these other people make good points about we need to own up to how relevant YouTube is. And yet at the same time, I don't want to say that the sky is falling, because I think there's also softer elements like cultural cachet. When was the last time you talked with all your friends? Maybe you're younger, but when was the last time people got around and talked about the YouTube series that they're all watching? I mean, there's some value to the fact that YouTube is this very diverse content space and people aren't really consuming the same stuff. There's not those water cooler moments that leads to challenges down the road with other monetization levers. So I think it has a really broad reach, but I think there's a while until that translates into the monetization capabilities that you see on the streamers.
Super interesting point. And Ted Sarandos made, when he was asked about kind of the rise of YouTube, said, well, YouTube is just kind of a place where people go to waste time. And then essentially, as you're saying, we're going to pick up the talent once it matures. Is that really, do they have to do anything then? Are they just kind of using YouTube as an incubator, or do they also have to evolve and kind of move forward?
The streamers, I think that again, and like Julia Alexander has written this in a number of different ways. All these services are inevitably competing with all of these other services.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like YouTube's trying to become Netflix, Netflix is trying to become Twitch, Twitch is trying to become TikTok, So they're all in a competition with one another, not just for viewership, right? In which YouTube is sort of winning amongst the video elements. I guess I don't, maybe TikTok outranks it. I'm not sure, but also in monetization capabilities. Um, so I don't think that Netflix can rest on its laurels and just poach the top talent once it's risen to the top. Um, but I do think that they have a pricing model, and the other streamers have different pricing models that allow for merchandise and licensing and theme parks and all these things that come downstream from IP.
Yeah.
And YouTube's not really creating IP. It's just user generated content in the same way that like Instagram and TikTok make a lot of money for Meta and ByteDance, but they don't really break through into massive cultural moments. At the best, they have viral videos that maybe you remember a handful of those in your life.
Yeah.
But they just kind of have different outcomes. And I think that the outcomes the streaming services are engineered to produce have longer timelines.
Well, it's certainly a topic with a lot of nuance, and it seems to be something that's changing every 6 months from now. So we might have a different discussion then, but really appreciate the insight on that one. Should we go to the tweet?
The tweet, let's do the tweet.
Okay, so this Business Insider news that dropped last Monday was pretty unfortunate that they cut 21% of their staff, in large part because they say they're going all in on AI. And Ben Mullen from the New York Times tweeted what basically the union for these employers said was that they've moved away from journalism and towards greed. Obviously, everything's not black and white, but tell me what you think about that idea. Do you think that's actually happening, and how do you break that apart?
I think there's a few elements to play here. One, the Business Insider Union has been like famously one of the most melodramatic unions of all time. And I think that this phrasing, I mean, a lot of unions, they take a hyperbolic position to get attention. And I think there's an argument for the validity of that. But I don't think that this is a brazen pivot away from journalism toward greed. BI is rapidly trying to retool itself in order to persist into the future. And, I understand the layoffs obviously are unfortunate, and it's the union's job to stand up for their employees. So I respect what they're doing. Um, but I think that to say that this is a move born out of greed is a little bit less accurate than saying it's a move born out of necessity.
Yeah, it's a good point, and obviously their position is they have to put it on a certain position, so that makes sense that the phrasing is the way it is. At least from your experience, I'm interested. I feel like we've seen a major shift in the last year across media organizations, not just Insider, from hey, we're not sure about AI at all to now this has to be part of the central workflow. How are you experiencing that transition in light of this Business Insider news?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I saw your podcast where you were talking about that with somebody. Um, I think BI is part of Axel Springer, and Axel Springer signed a deal with OpenAI. So clearly they have an enterprise AI operation within the organization. So I think that if they're not using it, they're not getting their money's worth. So I would understand why the BI brass is encouraging the reporters and lay people to use the technology. Again, I think it was the CEO of was it Breaker that you had on who was talking about this?
Stacker. Stacker.
Stacker, sorry. My apologies to Stacker. Um, yeah, like if you're talking about any other organization, really, using AI is going to be considered a plus. It's going to drive efficiencies, and it's sort of a no-brainer. When it comes to journalism, when it comes to writing, when it comes to accuracy, of course, these things get a little bit more nuanced, but I think we're definitely heading toward a world. I mean, you've unwittingly stumbled across like the conversation that I have every day over the last like 12 months. We're moving toward a world in which whether you want to say they're writers or they're journalists or they're critical thinkers or they're storytellers or whatever the phrasing is, we're becoming a little bit more like prompt engineers. And I think that this transition needs to be handled prudently, but to stick your head in the sand, well, I kind of just outed my position. To think otherwise is to stick your head in the sand.
Yeah, it's obviously a hard transition to make, especially when you come from a more traditional journalistic background. So to adopt these tools in such a fast-paced environment, I can only imagine is super scary. But it is the way the world is going, so we will have to say. All right, should we get to our deal?
Yeah, let's do the deal.
So this is going to kind of continue a lot of the conversation we just had, but a really interesting dynamic about the New York Times is that while they just signed this licensing deal with Amazon, they're also in a copyright lawsuit with OpenAI. So it kind of seems like they're trying to play both sides here and not really sure what their position is. Is there a specific strategic advantage to, being partnered with Amazon and then filing a lawsuit against a chatbot? How do you kind of look at that?
It's a great question. To say this is 4D chess is an understatement. I feel
I,
like this is like 5D chess. I'm just speculating. I think that there are certainly ways in which it could be a strategic advantage. One, they're sort of zigging where everyone zagged. All the main AI licensing deals have been with OpenAI, which does have the backing of Microsoft and is sort of the first mover, but in real world conversations, it's a startup and it is responsible for a very small percentage of web search and web traffic. Probably has a lot less name brand recognition than Amazon. Amazon has a massive business infrastructure that goes far beyond its retail store. I do a lot of reporting on Prime Video, and sometimes you forget how many different companies and businesses Amazon owns. Um, so I think that that licensing partnership allows them, to your point, to kind of have their cake and eat it too. They're doing, I would say, a service for the journalism industry in sort of carrying the torch and taking that lawsuit to OpenAI. I think somebody had to do it, and they have the resources and the pedigree, and I think the mission to be able to do it. But I appreciate that that doesn't mean that they don't get to maybe partake of the spoils of AI. I think the crux of the argument with OpenAI is them saying, "Hey, you trained on our data without our permission," right?
Hmm.
In at no point do they say you can't train on our data. You just need to get our permission. And I think that this is kind of what they've signaled with this Amazon deal. I think I also read somewhere that it was like this just means that Amazon wrote a bigger check, which is pretty plausible because the OpenAI checks have been paltry. And I think kudos to the New York Times just from a bargaining position to say, we'll hold out on that. There's going to be other AI companies coming down the pipe. They might have more money, and they know the New York Times is the most trusted name brand in news. So OpenAI might have built kind of a coalition, and they're making some smart moves on that front. But I think this is a smart move for the Times. It's a smarter move for Amazon. I honestly think in some ways Amazon benefits a little bit more. Um, but
Hmm.
we'll see. Amazon, like all these tech companies, kind of they do one thing right and they do a bunch of other things wrong. So I had to Google beforehand. I was like, what does Amazon have like a Gen AI or a search? Like they obviously are backing Anthropic, which I think is their big play. But um, I think it's a cagey maneuver, and I'm happy to see that the Times is kind of getting in the mud with the rest of us.
No, I agree totally. And I think it's part of a larger trend for publishers of all sizes, from the New York Times towards smaller publishers, of trying to adapt to an environment that's not built off the internet, right? So distribution's no longer built on clicks anymore, it's built on chatbots. And I think one of the interesting ways to be able to build revenue is through commerce, right? Whether that's through an Amazon store or like they were saying that they'll be able to train the new Amazon Alexa with New York Times content. So that could kind of be a really interesting integration for that. So we will have to see. All right, should we go to our trivia?
Yeah, let's do it.
So this first one, tell me which one is the lie. Digiday was founded in 2013. Fear Street Prom Queen is the #1 movie on Netflix right now. And Edward R. Murrow is played by George Clooney in Good Night and Good Luck.
I have to feel like it's number one.
The answer would be #1. Digiday was founded in 2008. So there we go. There we go. Let's try to go for two for two. True or false? Dotdash acquired Meredith Corporation for 2.7 billion in 2019.
False.
I'm gonna say you did report on this story, so I was.
It's like I remember where I was when that happened.
Yeah,
Yeah, I wrote a lot of stories about that. So I was like, yeah, that one was easier. The first one was hard. I was using like test taking methodology. It was like 2013 feels very specific.
yeah,
So, but yeah, I remember 2021 was the acquisition. I think it was $1.2 billion, at least a billion.
yeah. Well, Mark, really appreciate you coming on to kind of break down some of the top stories in media for this week. And Always love your insights in Adweek, so looking forward to keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate it.